Okay, everyone, welcome to Decoding the Microsoft 2024 Vulnerabilities Report, the final and I think the most exciting part of our Microsoft Vulnerabilities webinar series. I'm James Maud, Field CTO here at BeyondTrust, and today we'll be finding out what our panel of experts think about the changing Microsoft threat landscape off the back of the 2024 Microsoft Vulnerabilities Report published by BeyondTrust. We're going to find out what vulnerabilities and trends caught their attention, and also what their security recommendations are, how you should think about the Microsoft threat landscape, how you should stay secure, not only this year, but in the years to come. So let's start by introducing our truly global expert panel. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Paula Januszkiewicz, CEO of Secure and Secure Academy, that's spelled CQURE. Paula is an enterprise security MVP, honorable Microsoft regional director, and a world-class security expert who takes over 200 flights a year to deliver services for Secure, as well as speak at some of the top global security conferences. So welcome, Paula. Whereabouts in the world are you joining us from today?
Thank you so much for the invitation, first of all, and welcome. And today I have a total privilege to be in the studio, in our office, at home.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And we also have Terry Cutler joining us today, CEO of Cyology Labs and the author of the #1 Amazon best-selling book, Insider Secrets to Internet Safety, Advice from a Professional Hacker. As well as delivering top-level consultancy services, Terry's also really well known for his media appearances, where he's helping to educate businesses and individuals alike. So thank you for joining us today, Terry. How are you doing?
Any better, and I couldn't handle it.
That's fantastic. Next up, we've got Eliza-May Austin, CEO and co-founder of That Security Company. I will let you Google how you spell that security company, because she's done a good job of obfuscating the name there, and the pioneering Pocket SIM service. From her early inspiration from the classic 1995 movies The Net, where she saw Sandra Bullock ordering a pizza online, Eliza's gone on to take her frustrations as an InfoSec practitioner and turn those into a successful business, focusing on no-nonsense, just defense. Eliza's collected numerous awards along the way, including being voted one of the most inspirational voices in cybersecurity. So welcome, Eliza, that inspirational voice. Great to have you joining us.
Oh, gosh, I'm going to have to live up to that now. Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here among such amazing people. Thank you.
And finally, last but not least, we've got Sami Laiho, one of the world's leading professionals in Windows OS and security, Chief Research Officer at Adbenize. Sami is known for taking a slightly different approach to education and once smuggled a hedgehog into his presentation at Microsoft Ignite to demonstrate MFA. I believe you got a little bit of a slap on the wrist for that one, Sami, if I'm correct.
Yeah, but it was totally worth it, so I'll do it again.
And having worked in Microsoft OS security in his native Finland since the mid-1990s, Sami's also rumoured to be the inspiration for Finland's Eurovision entry of Windows 95 Man this year. So, might just be a coincidence, might not be, but the rumours are out there now. So welcome, Sami. We're just checking you haven't got any live animals you're presenting today.
No animals will be heard during this presentation, no worries.
That's fantastic. So a quick bit of scene setting for those who maybe aren't familiar with the annual Microsoft Vulnerabilities Report published by BeyondTrust. It's an analysis of the previous year's vulnerabilities that get published in the Microsoft Patch Tuesday updates, provided in an easy-to-consume format that lets you see the trends in the Microsoft vulnerability landscape, alongside some analysis of the most interesting and engaging vulnerabilities that we see, some of the more interesting angles that are going on behind the scenes there. We provide expert commentary to help you stay as secure as possible. And as this is the 11th edition of the report, we're looking back across 11 years. If you look at the report, you'll see a lot of Spinal Tap turning up to 11 references. I can only apologize for our CTO, Mark Mayfrey, sneaking those in. But we're going to dive in and see what our panelists not only think about what's happened in this year's report, but what's changed for them in general over the past 11 years. We've seen a lot of changes. We're not worrying so much about Internet Explorer vulnerabilities, or maybe we still are. Who knows? Let's find out. So let's kick things off with Paula. Paula, what caught your eye in the report?
First of all, what is absolutely interesting is that there is a significant drop in elevation of privilege vulnerabilities, and most probably likely due to improved security in Azure and Windows Server itself and so on. And it's really good to see that, because one thing, of course, can be platform related, but also another thing could be related with our mindset and being more aware what privilege access actually is. And it's just a wild ticket directly to the environment, so hackers don't need to struggle. So we can see that has been, with time, fixed in some sense for many companies. Therefore, the statistic is way lower. And I think this is a first great observation over here, because it just means that it's going to be harder, not impossible, but harder to get to places.
Absolutely. And Paula, in the general trend of how people are operating in their Windows environments, when this report first started 11 years ago, a lot of organizations just believed that people had to have local administrator rights. They had to be given these things. And we've been on a bit of a journey where regulations kicked in, education's kicked in. And I think, fewer people now are allowing their end users to have those local administrator privileges. Do you see that other side to the coin there, that we're seeing a reduction in the granting of privileges as well as the vulnerabilities that allow you to elevate?
Yeah, absolutely that direction. And though we can see, for example, the increase, for example, in spoofing vulnerabilities, a decrease in critical vulnerabilities. So that's just basically what we see is a positive trend. But of course, trend has its colors as well. So there is a major trend that in general, we are becoming more secure. Infrastructures are just better in terms of security, staffing, knowledge, capabilities, and so on. But at the same time, there are some trends that when we see the focus on these, then the organizations are in that small chunk not prepared. That's why we can see the increase, because there's a one spot that someone hits, and then eventually we can see that one growing over there. So in general, the trend it's very good, especially when we look into the reports from the past years, and we can see, for example, also the other stats, how long hackers are present in the network before they are getting discovered, and that stat is also decreasing. So I think that we finally reach some kind of a point where we can be just a little bit satisfied that we see that our efforts and in general building awareness all around, all of you guys here and me too, eventually, and many other folks out there that are talking about cybersecurity and the importance that actually brings a change. Yeah, in some areas, yeah, but it does. So it's really nice to see that kind of a impact as well on the statistic.
And what about you, Sami? What did you take from this year's report? What stood out to you?
Well, normally when I look at any kind of vulnerabilities, I've been preaching this, getting rid of admin rights for 20 years now, or more than 20 years now. So I've always been interested in anything basically that allows elevation from a limited user. I usually just kind of like, I don't look at the ones that are already assuming that you're a full admin, because I think you lost the game anyway. So I'm interested in anything that can be executed with limited access, and then basically remote code execution. So I've honestly thought that in 20 years we still would have been in a situation where remote code execution would have bypassed principle of least privilege in these attacks, or elevating of privileges in these attacks. So I was already assuming that would have happened, that RCE would be on top of the principle of least privilege related issues. So I think we still have some work to do, but in general, of course, I'm happy to see that we have some sort of a trend in this amount of vulnerabilities staying relatively static for the past 5 years. I think we reached some sort of a new base level, because we were like in a very, very, very high curve going up all the time with like 50% increase, 90% increase. And now it's been so stable for the past 5 years. But we're still at a very high level. It's still more than 100 vulnerabilities per month. And I think we are still at the place where people have to more and more also focus on automating the updating instead of going through these manual processes. So what I see and hear all the time is still people asking me like, Sami, we used to be an IT department. We're just a patching department. So this is Windows and Microsoft related. That's 100. But then some statistics say that there's about 20,000 patches for a big enterprise per year when you count in all the external surface as well, firewalls. Everything has a firmware now. I just realized that this pen has a firmware. So, I mean, everything has a firmware. So there's so much to patch. So, but anyway, nice to see that we've found some sort of a level. And But I'm still, I can't say that I'm not amazed about the fact that we wouldn't see a even more dramatic decrease in getting to that privilege level of admin or system, or it's still the crown jewel, still what all of us need to protect.
Yeah, and a lot of these things they move very slowly in the Microsoft landscape, right? They have a very long tail of software they have to support. We saw one of the things called out in this year's report was around the principle of vulnerabilities, where we saw, a few years ago, everyone remembers print nightmare things and some of these challenges that were coming up. And then if you looked at the data, people often thought that was the only thing. But actually, when you start to look at the vulnerabilities over the years, they're actually, every year, principle of vulnerabilities were doubling, because every time they patched this 20-plus-year-old bit of code in the operating system, people found a way around it. And some of those things will hang around for a long time, will cause headaches. And I often sit there and think, well, okay, if that was the principle, what else is out there that just hasn't even been looked at yet, hasn't been targeted, that's going to be the next 3-4 years of issues there?
There's still the, when you talk to the kernel team of the core Windows OS, they still say that if you look at the code base of more than 70 million lines of code, they say that nothing has fundamentally changed since 1993, but barely nothing's untouched. But there's still that word of barely, which means that there's so ancient code. And the problem with Windows is, like the bigger problem is that Windows has to support code that's from 1993. I'm running a Commodore 64 emulator, which was built in 1995. So it's fully supported, no virtualization, running natively on the operating system that you try to secure in 2024. So that's the biggest problem. Microsoft is not in the place like Apple that can actually just change the CPU architecture if they want to, because they can't sacrifice the compatibility that they have. Now, the new ARM processors that they're supporting or just started supporting on Windows, that's a nice change to this trend, but I'm still waiting for Microsoft to actually build a new OS rather than just giving us the old 1993.
Yeah, imagine if you'd had a child in 1993 and were still having to support them and make sure, they're financially secure and have them inside your house and all this kind of thing, and up until 2024. It is quite a challenge there. Eliza, what was your take on the report?
I'm going to sound quite dull, actually, and what I picked on holistically, I know it's a bit of a buzzword, is similar to Paula and Sami there, that the persistence of remote code execution and privilege escalation is predictable. So the more that we move away from traditional network architectures and talking about penetrating the peripheries, that's going to become more of a thing. So I think that the actual target is going to become the user and the account holder. And I think that the serverless nature that companies are going down to protect themselves, and also the sort of zero trust way of working that we're developing as an industry, is just creating new avenues and different avenues for exploitation. And it's enhancing in this way that we're looking more at the account holder. So for me, it was that was sort of verified in the report. So as Sami said, some really awesome stuff. Like, we're obviously making some good changes, and as Paula says, it's evident in the way that we're moving forward as an industry. It's nice to see, but we can't be complacent. And I think that this is going to continue, and there's going to be a concentration around targeting users, and I think that's plain to see here. That at the moment we can, yes, there's a reduction in critical vulnerabilities, but partly is that because the concentration is diverted of the attacker to go more on the account and attacking flaws in process and sort of the human element, so to speak, rather than burning 0 days or putting resources into exploiting code that's been developed well. I don't know. That's something that we will have to sort of ponder on ourselves, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because what we've seen in the report as well is we saw kind of a rise in elevation of privilege vulnerabilities, at the start of when we started looking at this report. And a lot of that was driven as, you it used to be the case you could just land on an endpoint with a phishing email and the user would have local admin rights. And like Sami says, the game is lost then. Those were the good old days where, one link and then you critical vulnerability. And I think at the time when we first started this report, almost half of the vulnerabilities were critical vulnerabilities. So, that has significantly changed. But I think what we're seeing now is interesting as we've kind of got on top of giving everyone local admin rights. And then as we've got on top of the elevation of privilege vulnerability in the software, things have moved on. Like you say, it's more identity centric, it's more cloud centric. So suddenly those things that attackers could exploit in the early days where users have just been given wild permissions to do things because no one knew any better, we're now seeing in the cloud where you compromise that user's account, log into Office 365, Entra ID, whatever we're talking about. Suddenly you discover there's a load of permissions and a load of things you can exploit there without having to write any malicious code at all. This idea that you can just log in rather than hack in. And I think that's a really interesting trend that we've started to see. And it's not just little organizations being hit with this. We saw in the report highlighted the Midnight Blizzard attacks against Microsoft, where hidden connections, permissions in the cloud, roles and entitlements suddenly allow a path to privilege through those systems. So I think that's a really good trend to call out there, that we're looking at more account and identity centric thing. And we don't necessarily need the vulnerability anymore. So, attackers are a bit like water, aren't they? They're looking for the path of least resistance. If they don't need to write a 0-day code and they can just take a credential dump online and log in, that's a lot easier. Okay, Terry, what do you think to this year's report? What stood out for you?
I think we're starting to see more increased attacks around phishing. So as the three of them mentioned, we need a more holistic approach to securing your cybersecurity. There's so many new attack vectors that they're being leveraged right now to bypass the infrastructure. So for example, back in the day, most of the IT budget was spent on a new firewall and all these kind of things. Hackers aren't trying to waste time trying to hack your firewall and get detected when all they have to do is send a crafty looking email to one of your employees, have them click on a link they're not supposed to, and lets them in. And not only that, even if you got two-step verification turned on, you may have some old software in there, like Sami mentioned, that requires backward compatibility. And now you're supporting old login methods that can bypass 2FA. And now we're actually seeing some customers being ransomed with BitLocker instead of a ransomware. So they're using lay of the land tools to go in and infect companies. And we're also seeing legitimate companies getting hacked into, and they're being used as a jump point to phish another company. And because their domains are legit, it causes more chaos. And of course, once they get access to their cloud infrastructure, they're not monitoring the cloud for maybe a new inbox rule, weird VPN connections going in. So they need something that's more holistically monitoring their infrastructure and their attack vectors. Because also where you're seeing all kinds of compromises happening right now, where passwords are leaking on the dark web, and like most users, they're using the same password everywhere online. So instead of using their personal Gmails for their real estate company, for example, that just got hacked into, they're using their corporate email. And once they get into that inbox, now they can download the inbox, the contents of the inbox, causing a business email compromise. So I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg now, especially like when was that, a year or so ago, Microsoft's code may have been seen by cyber criminals. So there might be some attacks coming in the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some variety of really interesting things targeting those identities using, relatively interesting phishing campaigns that aren't necessarily targeting users with malware anymore. They're not trying to get you to download the malicious document. And maybe we'll actually dive into Office in a second because it's an interesting area for development there. But they're looking to direct you to an evil jinx, attack adversary in the middle. They're trying to capture the username and password. And then they're proxying through an MFA request. So unless you've got something like a FIDO2 token, which, as you point out, not all old systems, legacy systems can support this infrastructure. Not a lot of organizations do that kind of level of thing. They assume that they've learned from some of the previous attacks that maybe push notifications are a bad idea because users just get fatigued and will just click yes to make the thing go away. It's a bit like teenagers nagging you. In this case, teenage hackers just smashing those requests until you say yes. But they've then gone on to, now they can capture that. They can have a session. They can get in. They can start to do things. Or in some of the most large-scale attacks we saw last year where, Okta was breached and people were able to access, significant Okta super admin accounts. And sometimes they were very well protected. They had good policies in place. They had maybe FIDO2 MFA, but someone was able just to call up the help desk and say, hey, could you just reset my MFA factor? I've forgotten my key today. I've forgotten my device today. And the help desk, being helpful, do these things, and suddenly all that investment, those controls you put in place, can be undermined through some basic social engineering. So I think there's some really interesting things around identity that organizations often have blind spots around, and often think, well, there's that great meme on the internet with this very secure gate with no fence around it, and everyone just walks around the very secure gate. And we sometimes get a little bit like that with MFA and controls, where actually we forget about the privileges and the access and the vulnerabilities in our environment that lie the other side of that gate, and it can go wrong very quickly there. So I mentioned Office. So Office is an interesting one. As practitioners, maybe Paula, what have you seen improvements in the security in Office? I know they've done a lot of work there to improve the security in Office by default.
Well, the first thing that we should definitely talk about is the impossibility to use macros. Yeah, because this is like a national way to attack everybody. And at the end, this is so good to see that path is actually, in some sense, cut off. And in general, I would say more on the other side, the awareness related with that, because macro being a default way to attack through Office files and so on, has been talked through on many different security awareness sessions as well. So people are more cautious. Also, when they're using Office in your home environment, they know that macro is a bad thing in general, because we're not really using it unless it's like some very specific environment and you allow it because of a matter of some exception. So that's basically one of the major improvements over there. And of course, following up with that, when you've got in general the attack surface reduction rules, then you can specify that you should not be able to start child processes from the Office applications, which means that could be really anything, starting with a CMD, PowerShell, something custom, and so on, because there's always some kind of a process that needs to start. And there's also another angle on the top of that. You've got, for example, solutions like, in general, anti-exploitation, so exploit guard-ish solutions that are generally saying right now that basically will disallow injections to the Office applications process as well. Yeah, because it's another way of launching things. And another angle as well that came to the field is basically that blocking the possibility of having the unwanted processes to connect through the network. And however simple that sounds, the Windows firewall even gets its second life, because with the advanced firewall, you have so many rules that you can configure with the logic that you disallow everything that comes out that you don't know, while of course the logic for so many years was the opposite. Yeah, so you block the traffic, but then you allow everything to come out. Right now, it's basically blocking that everything thing too. Yeah, so when you've got a PowerShell or command prompt, like why these guys supposed to be connecting to the network? There is no need. Normally, you only have like Outlook, a browser, and then maybe some custom apps, but honestly, there's just like 10, which is maximum, maybe, not even that. So when we apply that kind of a policy all together with understanding the whole attack path, not only just Office, but how attacking Office impacts the other components of the infrastructure and what are these other layers of the attack, then we've got a pretty nice layers of security that are covered. And when people realize that, then they start to implement things that are free sometimes. And it's just a matter of changing the rules. It's just a matter of using application whitelisting and so on. And even though this is not perfectly configured, it's already a great risk minimizer that will just make someone to pick someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Stopping yourself being the low-hanging fruit. And I'm curious, actually, Sami, from your perspective as a practitioner, all those things sound fantastic. They sound great things, but how many companies out there are you seeing that are actually taking advantage of those things and being able to configure them? Or are they still just sat there as nice features that no one's enabled yet in their environment?
I would say that these kind of very easy, just tick a box, some of them are taken care by most of my customers now suddenly realizing that Windows operating system by default just runs as Windows Home, basically. So they haven't configured any baselines. Now they're kind of waking up to the fact that you actually, even if you buy a more expensive enterprise license, you actually have to change it to an enterprise world operating system by installing the security baseline. So that takes care of some of them. So it's getting better. But I would say that I usually start new projects with customers by doing an audit. And I would say that most of the stuff that people are already paying for, they're still not actually using them. So it's still not, the cool new things in Azure, they're relatively easy to just turn on. So they're more like a flip switch. You just flip it and that's fine. But then, of course, that does not apply to the fact that 95% of my customers still have an on-premise. And someone was just asking me, like, in general, Sami, can you make a statement that whether we are more commonly attacked if we have Azure or not? And it's like, it's not really about the fact whether Azure is safer than on-prem, because as long as 95% of customers have on-prem, that means that the attacker will take the route with the least resistance, meaning that why would you attack a company which just completely natively Azure if you have someone who's just got everything open up as it was for the past 20 years? So it's not even about which one is safe, but as long as we have the unsafe option to attack against, why take the difficult route? So I think it's getting better with the Azure stuff, but the patching on-prem or getting these security features implemented on the on-prem side, that's still a big hurdle.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Eliza, you're known for your no-nonsense, just defense approach and making sure that customers are getting the value out of things. Your Pocket SIM service is focused on standing up services that ultimately customers can take over and run on their own using open source as much as possible. So what's your take on these features, this value that customers maybe have in their environment but haven't unlocked yet?
I think there's a lot of money flying around in the cybersecurity industry that is absolutely dedicated to making sure people that have got the responsibility for IT and cybersecurity have a diverted concentration away from native tooling. So that's part of the problem. So there's a lot of people that are intelligent people, they know what they're doing, they're experienced, but they don't have the time to constantly keep up to date with all the latest functionality, buttons they can press and what they can do. And in the meantime, they go to conferences and looking on LinkedIn and all these kinds of things and being bombarded with these tools that are selling them a problem that they didn't even know that they had, that could have been solved by simply looking at native functionality that they've got. So a lot of the experience that we're seeing away from like the Pocket SIM side of things, but more on the consultancy approach, is being invited into a business to help them with maybe an RFP or, looking at some of the problems that they're having and how do we get around this and what tools should we pick and who should we work with on this. And you look at the tech stack that they've got and you go, okay, you could pay a little bit more with the tooling you've already got. And this doesn't just go for Microsoft, this goes for anything really. And have this functionality or whatever. And we worked, and a good example of this is we worked on a Purple Team engagement. And this company had spent an absolute ton of cash on this endpoint management solution that was all like, EDR, XDR, MDR, whatever else, DR. And during this Purple Team exercise, it didn't pick up a lot of what we were doing, but Windows Defender did because it's come on loads. And I'm not even like a Microsoft nut or anything, but it's come on loads and they didn't even know they had it. So it wasn't invested in the scene. It wasn't being monitored. There wasn't a team dedicated to it. They thought they'd switched it off and they hadn't. And they'd paid all this money for this other tool to duplicate the functionality and it didn't do it as well. And they could have saved all that cash by just taking a step back and going, okay, let's just assess what we've currently got and look at that. But they don't. And there's a lot of problems around why that is. And it's not just down to the vendor market. It's also down to the fact that you get new senior leaders into businesses that look at the situation and go, how can I make my CV look better? rather than how can I do what's right for the business. And there's some fundamental problems in how we're doing security operations as an industry rather than just tooling.
I think that's a wonderful point. I remember talking to someone a little while back who'd invested a substantial chunk of money into, as you say, all the DRs, the EDR, the XDR, the ITDR, whatever these solutions are. And effectively what they were trying to achieve was sysmon policies. They wanted to know what was executing on endpoints. And, and bizarrely, I don't know why, they'd never come across actually using sysmon for that. So it's interesting sometimes when people have these things, they're so close, yet they don't quite realize that's there. And one of the things, I guess, Sami, Paula, all you guys have probably talked about a lot over the years, and we certainly talk about this a lot at Beyond Trust, is things we're talking about in this report, the vulnerabilities, the removing admin rights, why that's so important. They're very much the eat your vegetables of cybersecurity. Like, everyone knows that they're probably good for you to do those things, but it seems more fun to go and eat the bit of cake and the exciting new thing that's got, AI written all over it or something. So, we often fail to do the basics. And those are the things that, really make a difference. I mean, Terry, from your perspective, what should customers be thinking about when it comes to getting these basics of hygiene, and how should they be thinking about dealing with vulnerabilities and patching in their environment?
You need to understand that cybersecurity is not about convenience, okay? It's really important you take this stuff seriously. And, after listening to the other three, there's some really great points to bring up here. So even though yes, we're going to get rid of enable macros and such, lock things down more. Now we're starting to see an uprise in shadow IT. It's where employees are trying to circumvent what you just put in place because it hinders their productivity. And now they're setting up their own Wi-Fi network. They're doing like personal hotspots. They're doing ways to bypass, and it's causing data breaches for companies. And I had a similar experience with Eliza recently, where this company bought this really expensive, well-known EDR, XDR solution. And we did the same thing. We did an adversarial emulation test. We were able to hack the thing. We had over 2,000 attacks going on. Nobody saw anything except for Kali Linux got updated. Well, how is that possible? Well, they don't understand that logs get delayed. That these are log-based solutions. Logs get delayed. Logs get modified. Logs lie, right? You need to look at solutions that have full packet capture, for example. And we're also seeing a lot of companies that are being misguided by their MSPs specifically, because they're not cybersecurity experts, these MSPs. They're IT professionals. So think of IT as your family doctor, right? Would you ever ask your family doctor to perform laser eye surgery on you, right? And most people would say no. So that's where you need to work with a cybersecurity firm to come in and complement the IT department. We're not there to take their jobs. We're there to complement them and guide them into the latest solutions and attack techniques that could be avoided.
I really like that take. I'm still just reeling at the idea of my GP performing laser eye surgery on me. So I think that's a really good example of those specialisms. Actually, it's an interesting point. So maybe coming back to you, Paula, as we're thinking about this vulnerability landscape, we've said, hey, it's great. We're seeing this sort of lower plateau. We've seen critical vulnerabilities smooth out. Still a rise in vulnerabilities overall. There's still a lot of vulnerabilities out there. What are the key things that organizations should be thinking about when it comes to the Microsoft or the wider threat landscape that's out there?
Well, of course, there are many. Yeah, that depends how much time we got. But anyway, so the first one would be definitely to establish a good monitoring, or very good monitoring, because there are so many situations where solutions in which solutions possibly could fail, which we don't know what that will be. And then knowing more, it's basically a saver. So in any kind of incident response we were doing and so on, companies were almost always missing some type of information that would be nice to get centrally. Not that it was impossible to get it, but for example, impossible to get it centrally. Therefore, in this kind of a manual approach, it just took time, so the response was longer and so on. So you can imagine. And also, just to maybe share a quick story before I complete my answer. We had a customer quite recently. This was like a production farm. So when things are not working, they're not producing, they're basically losing lots of money. People suffer because they're losing their jobs, and that basically were the consequences of the attack. And there was a ransomware. It encrypted SAP servers and with all business information that they needed to produce things. And we were analyzing things, and then it looked like by all means that hackers kind of like immediately had a domain admin. And it's just like, it sounds very weird because you are digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And they truly basically got that. So there was like no signs of escalation. It was just immediately in use. Now, okay, that was very unsatisfying to see that, and we couldn't really find more information, but looking. And then we started to look also in the internet. Is there any kind of information about our company? Maybe someone sells access and so on. And honestly, I'll tell you, it was even worse. We found out on the GitHub that there was a third-party developer that they were using to support their services that made the code that he was writing for the company public so everybody could see it. And in the code, there was a clear text, as you can imagine, username and the password of the domain admin, including the domain, which was the name of the company. So it was just, you don't have to be like super smart really to use it. Yes, so someone just found it out, used that, literally logged in, and then of course acted on that company. So this is basically how it looked as well in logs. So that's why I'm saying monitoring, because of course this is a very horrible situation to experience. But at the same time, we don't know what we don't know, and more information, more sources of information we cover, less of a shadow data type of thing we got, and more we of course work on the data, put some logic in it, and so on. More we are able to identify, and I think that there is this assume the breach paradigm that we know, and there's so much truth in it that we learned by so many years. So when we still get that kind of an approach for at least small couple of years, I think it's a good approach still while we are implementing monitoring solutions and learning what kind of information we need to collect. So that will be my number one, honestly.
That's great. I think we're going to have to definitely get producer Jesse to slow-mo replay the simultaneous eye rolls from all the other guests there. As you mentioned, the credentials being exposed in GitHub, the faces were fantastic there. Did you have another one as well, Paula, you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, just like, the classic ones, I would say. So right now, the cybersecurity awareness, of course, it was always supposed to be popular and important and things like that. But this is also getting a new life because it's part of literally everything. We see cybersecurity commercials in TV. Banks are having their campaigns for the customers. There's lots of publicly shared information. I think not enough personally, but anyway, publicly shared information about that we should be careful. And of course, that information is very simple. Yeah, so it should speak to my grandma more than the cybersecurity professional, but it's there, which is great. But I think what's kind of missing too is friends and family approach in cybersecurity, because the attacks that are smartly designed are traveling through these people. So maybe through kids, maybe through parents, someone who is not tech savvy. So there should be more focus on friends and family. And okay, we are all obviously responsible, but we should really take that seriously. And that's my point, that we should take our knowledge and bring it to kids, bring it to family, and just do once in a quarter a little session to everybody, even on Teams, explaining what are the priorities while using safely internet and in general different solutions. So I think that will be the number one priority. And there are many, but maybe I would leave as well more of the options for the other guys.
Yeah, I actually, your point is an interesting one as well that you mentioned around this kind of assume breach mentality. And there was, a bit of a rallying cry in the industry a few years back where it was, you need to start assuming breach. From my take, I think people have almost taken that as a forget about defense in some areas, that they've sort of running down trying to chase I need all these detection solutions, and maybe are forgetting a little bit about the proactive side of things. Now, I can see Sami smiling here, so I'm going to pick on him and say, Sami, do you think people have misunderstood that rallying cry?
No, I think they totally have misunderstood it, yes. But I would say that, as Paul already mentioned, the assume breach, Zero Trust, although I hate the name, I think it's the worst name in the history of IT, but it has so much truth in it. So I would say that they think that Zero Trust can be achieved by buying a product. I don't teach products, I teach concepts. That's a common misunderstanding that I have with my customers, because I walk in and they're always like, so which product do we set up? I was like, I haven't gotten there yet. We have to get the concept right first, and then we'll pick a correct product for you, depending on your budget, depending on your needs, depending on your infrastructure and environment and everything. So, but I think the concepts are, most people think that zero trust means Big Brother is watching. We don't need to worry about this, but also in a very negative way, like Big Brother is watching everything I do. No one trusts me. People go and sell zero trust by saying that we can't let you log in with just a password because you use stupid passwords. So you need MFA. We can't let you install any kind of applications because you install silly applications that are not secure. It's like bam, bam, bam on negativity of like, no one wants that. Although at the end of the day, zero trust just aims it to make your systems work so that it is not, there's no difference whether you're working from your corporate office or from Starbucks. There's a very positive vibe to it and a very positive goal to it, but it's hard to sell to people because of all this negativity. Like I remember I made a mistake once. I was teaching some nurses in a hospital, and I thought I did a good job, and then a colleague of mine came to me and said that, Sami, that was an awesome talk, but you made a huge mistake. I was like, what did I do? You said that the users need to have difficult enough passwords. Like, so? You never say that. You say strong enough. Because if you tell them that this is difficult, they assume it's difficult. And they start to not want your solutions anymore. Although strong is exactly the same as difficult in this case for many, but still, I mean, it's I'm trying to get to this positive vibe about it, and I'm like, if I could choose what they really need to understand and what companies need to deploy, I would go for the zero trust. Of course, one of them being the principle of least privilege for those three main concepts. So that's my cup of tea. So I'm happy that that's there. It makes it easier for people to buy an ancient thing with a new brand cool name with a huge hype on it. So I don't mind as long as I get those admin rights out. That's, of course, my first goal, as like always. We've had some cases with BitLocker as well being used for ransomware, and can't do that without admin rights. So, I mean, the core concepts of zero trust and MFA, we need progress on that as well. As said, there's fatigue, which is now taken care by like pick your number solutions. I heard news this week that Singapore is now in the next 3 months going to forbid banks from using one-time passwords completely. So they're going to go for phishing-resistant MFA only for banking solutions. So there's constant progress there, but I do think that MFA we've done such a good job on MFA. That's the reason why phishing is not the only route to environments anymore, only needed route. But we still need to bump our game on that side, of course, because everyone now uses it. So enemies inventing more and more ways of getting around it. And then, I mean, getting rid of internal networks. I mean, I hate this internal network. The zero trust best thing ever, honestly, is this assume breach and just treat every network the same. Stop thinking that you have an internal network where your servers don't need a firewall, or in some cases, even your clients don't need a firewall because they're in a trusted network. So this is something I'm trying to fight against all the time. External access is another one. We just had a huge breach for our capital, city of Helsinki. Honestly, use a PAM solution for external connections into your network. I always say RDP stands for Ransomware Deployment Protocol, and just like stop that RDP stuff. Get a proper PAM in place and monitoring. So I would say that although as horrible as zero trust sounds, it has actually like the best 3 core components there, which means that then we're really left with application control. Like Paula said, I mean, application control, application allow listing, application whitelisting, whatever you want to call it. I mean, we got more than 1 million pieces of malware found per day. So we can't fight against it with the old style blacklisting of anti-malware. We just can't. It's mathematically impossible for us to succeed. So we have to get into the place where we list good apps instead of bad apps.
In fact, the name of the man, Fred Cohen, I think it was. So the guy who coined the term computer virus and antivirus and the kind of spawned this whole industry effectively by talking about computer viruses. He came up with a term in a research paper he wrote. A few months later, he actually wrote another research paper that said, I've decided that malware can constantly change, constantly evolve. We'll never be able to detect it all. We'll never be able to stop it all. And I think that was about the year that McAfee was founded. And then, the whole antivirus industry spun out from there, from the principle that we'll never be able to detect it all and stop it. And that's where it all spanned from. But I think actually coming down to some of the points we've been talking about here. So obviously, Sami likes all the principles of, least privilege, but doesn't like some of the acronyms around zero trust. We don't like some of the, chasing down products. It's all really about those core security principles that while the vulnerability landscape changed, the threat landscape changed, a lot of the underlying things we need to be thinking about to secure systems have remained constant. Eliza, for you, what are some of those key principles that you try and instill when you're doing your consultancy?
I think something I think that we always need to return to is that hackers are increasingly living off the land. And as an industry, we're increasingly living off of commercial products and not configurations. And that's a fundamental flaw in the way that we're doing things. And I think that we, kind of going back to what Sami was saying around the terminology, I think that, the whole, we're going to sell you DevSecOps as a product 5 years ago was the canary in the coal mine for this. So in terms of zero trust, the reason that we have this frustration where we're talking to companies that are going, right, we're going to buy a zero trust solution. The reason that sentence exists is because these same people are being approached by reputable brands, big ones, saying, we can sell you this productized version of zero trust. It's a way of working. So basically it's snake oil and thin air that is being sold there. So I think one of the main things that any company of any size and any budget can do to really sort of hone in on where they currently are now and where they need to be in the strategy to get there is to just understand what you've got. And one of the key principles of that is asset management. And we're still in a position now where we get that wrong. So you get these big companies and they might grow through acquisition or they're quite old and they just exist through departments popping up left, right and centre. And I know for a fact, because I've been in this position, there's companies that will bring in external consultants to try and work out what they've got. Like whether it's domains, IP addresses and URLs and or whether it's internal infrastructure that they don't really know what it does or where it is. So understanding that is really, really key. And it kind of goes back to what Paula was saying about visibility and monitoring. If you can't see it, and you don't know it's there, and you can't defend it. And I think with asset management, that's really key. So if you don't even know if it exists or where it is, you can't actually point a vulnerability scan at it. So then any vulnerability management process you have down the line is not going to cut it. It's not going to get anywhere. So we strip all of the fancy stuff back, all the way back to basics, back to the bedrock. Asset management is key, and vulnerability management and it exists, on top of that. And when we've got that right, we can start getting to the point of looking at assumed compromise attacks or black box attacks and all those kinds of things. But at the moment, I think there's a lot of companies that have not even got a clear understanding of what their ownership looks like.
No, it's a great point. There was a fantastic blog a few years ago by one of the architects of Microsoft, I believe it was, involved in their threat intelligence team that had this pyramid, the hierarchy of cyber needs. And it's sort of based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the bottom, needed to be able to manage your assets. You needed to be able to manage the applications, the identities. And then the pinnacle of this was detection. The idea being, if you can't manage them, if you don't know what your assets are, you don't know what's deployed on them, you don't know who's using them, then you can't detect things. You can't do all this stuff. And he was saying that a lot of people raced into detection, or what my colleague calls the inverted pyramid of ignorance, where you're just focusing entirely on detect all the things, even though you don't know where all the assets are, even though you don't know who all the users are, even though you don't know who all the third parties who you've granted access to that RDP, that VPN over the years are. So I think that's an excellent point, and actually ties in, both those things around the zero trust and chasing acronyms and budget and thinking about identities and the sort of age of identity security and securing accounts. We've seen Gartner come out and talk about things like ITDR, the latest, acronym everyone's talking about. And if you start reading into it, it's not a product, it's a discipline. And it's about bringing your identity access management and security teams together, because they need to be talking to each other. They need to be sharing visibility. These disparate systems, where do privileges lie now? Is it in your on-premise AD? Is it in your Salesforce in the cloud? Is it in Okta? There's all these different places. So it becomes very challenging. And if we just think about it as a product, it doesn't always make sense. So Terry, when it comes to, securing identities and how we should think about protecting identities, what are some of the things that you think are important there?
Well, I after hearing Sami mention his frustration, and I echo and feel those frustrations too. And by the way, rum and cokes work really well sometimes during the day. But they understand that there's no silver bullet to stop a hacker, right? They can only make it harder for them to get in. So tools like MFA is going to be really key here. And I had a similar experience where, and we do a lot of work in healthcare. Developers were building web applications and hard coded the username and password as well into the code. And, unfortunately, the developers are not coding with security in mind. So they need to have proper training to understand how to do basic penetration testing on their own web applications. And that's why the software development lifecycle is so key here. And I also agree that the end users need to be trained at home. So I've been doing that since 2008. And one of the mindsets I always hear is that this will never happen. This will never happen to me. And then until it's too late. So they understand it's not a question of if, but when.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's very difficult with somebody, because we need to educate users, but we also need to put in the controls so they can't easily shoot themselves or the business in the foot when something goes wrong. So it's kind of that. You can't just train a user and then give them all the privileges and access. You've got to kind of balance both worlds there. So it's an interesting challenge for organizations to deal with. And you brought up a point there with the applications as well. We've seen this huge growth in machine identities or non-human identities or whatever buzzword or acronym we're going to start referring to them as, NHIs or whatever we're talking about. But they can outnumber in some organizations actual human identities 10 to 1. They tend to be privileged. They tend to not have MFA enabled. And yet we will hard code them into scripts that we leave on a shared network folder somewhere. So,
we hear a lot of companies too that are going after, they want to say, we want to implement zero trust. But, to bring in the methodology, bring in technology that has to automate the logging and the remediation, all these kind of things, in my opinion, it's going to be a very expensive process, especially with small businesses that don't have the time, money, or resource to deal with cybersecurity. It's going to be a challenge for these folks as well. So there needs to be heavy automation and process in place to pull some of this stuff off.
Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts on non-human identities and some of the challenges we're facing around those?
Well, there, of course, if I would look at almost any single audit report that I produce for my customers, I would say that I still 9 out of 10 would be the case where the domain admins group has at least one service account in it. When talking about non-human accounts, I mean I bump into this all the time where you have very strict control over the AD infrastructure in general, and then you have a simple web form where you can actually just go and click and make yourself a global admin, domain admin, because that is using an account which is used by the identity and access management, which requires domain admin for the AD. So everyone else is using privileged access workstations and privileged access management and very, very hard protections against being able to manage that Active Directory. And then you have a web form where you just go and click, because identity and access management has not been involved in this. Or I have an auditor, I have Microsoft, for example, when they do their audits for AD, they tell the customers that the only supported way of doing this is to have that auditing account as an enterprise admin for the AD.
If I can build on something too, like whenever we do penetration testing, we're obviously testing for default passwords. And we obviously see sometimes the default password admin is still active. But the customer said, well, no, we changed it in the web application. Yeah, but you forgot to change it for Telnet and SSH. So it's still lingering. So penetration testing is really key to find all these vulnerabilities that are hidden in their network.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen, I was talking to some red teamers recently, and they were saying, just curb roasting and AD certificate services. Every organization they're going into, they think, even if they've got a solution in place where they think, well, we've got all these, domain admins, they're in a vault somewhere, they're super secure, but then there's a certificate misconfiguration that allows someone to authenticate them as them anyway, or capture a service account that's highly privileged and all these kind of things. So yeah, it does seem to be that more holistic view of all the ways that privilege can be accessed through the different configurations.
Or everything is okay, but they're managing the passwords in the password management portal, and they're storing their credentials in the browser, which was the case from one of the projects I was doing. Through the vulnerability to the server, get the credentials of a server admin guy, get into his laptop, extracted credentials from Chrome, and he had over there stored the password to the password management portal. So that was also a good finding, and all the other passwords too.
Yeah, and again, that's something a lot of people don't even realize that they can actually disable through group policy and things, those password stores in browsers, because a couple of years ago, Cisco got hit. An attack was able to get the credentials out of a Chrome store and use that to authenticate into VPN and gain broad access to a network that they, then just used off-the-shelf tools to move around. We saw the Okta support breach. A support organization was initially compromised because there was a privileged service account stored in the Chrome password vault that allowed access to pull down attachments from customers' support cases, which contained HAR files, which contained active sessions to authenticate in. So yeah, those things fairly low-hanging fruit for organizations to deal with, but a lot of organizations don't have them maybe on their radar to pick up on.
That's what I was also about to say, that it's always about simple things, and you've got that thing, and you've got that big organization, and it's so unbelievable always that such a tiny thing completely destroys multi-million company out there just because something was just not managed properly. So one thing, of course, to add on the top is that penetration tests in general, they were really hot in the past, and they are, of course, because they are necessary right now. But I think we should a little bit more look towards the way how we perform them. Yeah, so penetration tests, it's no longer that kind of a test and that's it, but it's more like a posture evaluation. Yeah, however advanced that sounds, but what is necessary for the tester or the company that's doing that to bring, it's a really nice and mature consultancy to say okay, listen, you've got this error over there. You can change it, of course, with a couple of clicks, but first you need to understand what kind of things this thing impacts, because that person works here today, but it's going to go somewhere else and it's going to make the same mistake because he or she used to configure things in that kind of way. So I think we need to, in general, put more effort in the pen test for explaining to the customer what kind of things are there, and to test the infrastructure from many angles. I know that not everybody wants to pay for this. I know that not everybody has time for this. Maybe we should just push forward if you were in a consulting company, but if you were managing the cybersecurity, then maybe look a little bit closer to the situations when pen testers can actually, or book that additional time so that pen testers can explain what is actually happening in the back.
No, that's fantastic advice. I think that, again, the thing with pen tests is they're a snapshot at a point in time often, and our environments are increasingly dynamic. There's, identities, accounts, and machines, everything in the cloud being spun up and spun down all the time. So often organizations, will struggle to get a realistic snapshot and understand the continuous monitoring. Or you have the worst case scenarios where it's the business, all the engineers demand to know exactly when the test is happening so they can go turn off all vulnerable boxes so you can't see them. And then you have to remember to do the test at a time you haven't told them. And suddenly all these things light up on the IP scans there. So we're starting to run out of time here. So I just wanted to jump in. We've had a few questions in advance. Feel free, whoever wants to jump in and take these ones. The first one is, what was the weirdest or most unusual vulnerability you saw in this report this year?
I think the one with the Outlook remote code execution, that CV23397, I wrote it down. Honestly, having people nowadays thinking that nothing will happen without you clicking something. We kind of like, browsers have been, Windows since Vista has supported mandatory integrity control and integrity levels, and we got lots of different protections against the fact that you cannot bad things don't happen if you just open a web page, for example. Just you have to click something. But now we have an Outlook vulnerability where by just sending code in and then getting a notification for that meeting, having a ringtone that's actually malicious. That is just this is the case where I'm like with my kids, where they come up with the most creative ways of getting past my parental controls. That this is just like this feels. Like I was going to a son's bedroom and he's playing music after 11 o'clock, and I'm like, how can he be playing music? And then I found him under his blanket, and he had an iPhone where he had made a playlist of music with the alarms. So he has a different alarm going off every 5 minutes because he can play a song from Apple Music. So it's just like that. I mean, it's like the creativity, and at the same time, I'm like, high five, and then I have to go, and I know my wife's listening, and I have to be like, don't do that, don't do that. That's bad. But like, this is what I feel like here. The creativity of having that code executed by a ringtone with no user intervention. That was mind blowing. I mean, it needed a connection, an SMB connection outside, so relatively easy to block as long as you control your SMB not being allowed outbound. But now we have so many people that go home with the 4G, 5G modems, so they're relying on the host firewall. And the host firewall, like Paula said, is usually everything allowed outbound.
It's an absolutely fantastic, it's a fantastically interesting vulnerability, like you say. I think it's CVSS of 9.8, so basically as bad as it can possibly get. The idea was that you could send someone an email. It had a little bit of code in the email that said, this is a notification tone to play, but you could point that to an SMB server that could be on the internet. So as long as that traffic was allowed out, it would basically try and authenticate. You could capture an NTLM hash.
Leave the NTLM hash, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's a fantastically interesting one. And I think, you're right. It really speaks to some of the creativity of the attackers out there and the way they're going after these things. But again, that one was so ubiquitous that, all these people running Outlook suddenly realized, oh, anyone can send that email now, capture that hash. Some real challenges. Anyone else got anything that particularly jumped out as a bit of a, wow, I didn't expect that to happen moment?
I was going to touch on the same one as Sami, actually, but to keep it a bit more dynamic for whoever's watching, I won't. But what did stand out to me is just like, however good we get at technical controls, the user is increasingly becoming the attack vector. And I think that was displayed quite evidently and well in the Russian rom-com attack that there was a description of as well. So, we can't be complacent, I guess. And rather than, using the report, which is fantastic and some very good news in it, to give ourselves a pat on the back, I think the pat on the back needs to come with a big, solid push to keep us going in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. The rom-com attack's a great one where we've seen these controls put in place to disable macros running, add this mark of the web to files, all these controls, and then someone came up with a very creative way to work around that and get code to execute anyway. So it's interesting to see as Microsoft, tighten the screws and really stop, internet facing macros down enough to internet running and all these things being allowed by default, how attackers will seek to find that, code from 1993 that Sami talked about that they can still exploit and still get things to run there. One of the other questions was, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing at Microsoft to make them produce less vulnerabilities and keep driving the figures down and stop them plateauing, what would it be? Does anyone want to wave a magic wand for us?
Can I just say on that, I think that to answer that question very vaguely and probably a bit rubbishly, I think that if the magic wand could eradicate vulnerabilities, it's not going to happen. What we are doing is getting to a point where they are decreasing. So that's awesome. And also, I think it's testament to choosing a way of working and doing it well. So like I mentioned DevSecOps earlier, I think Microsoft's been quite vocal in the fact that they utilize DevSecOps as a method of developing code, and that, that they've got a priority on developing secure code. And actually, this report does, pose some evidence there that if that is done well, the output is a positive one, and that's achievable. So for me, I think that's a really good takeaway from it. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah. Paula, you wanted to wave your magic wand as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, very good point, Eliza. So I'll be adding to this one thing that Microsoft, of course, it's security focused right now, but it wasn't like that in the past. So that changed, and of course, there are so many different security solutions that we are here using and so on. But right now, it's shifted a little bit more towards AI, automation, efficiency, and so on. And that security is a little bit behind. Yeah, or better, we are not really hearing it like that. Of course, there is a security copilot and things like that, but it's not like a number one thing as it used to be. Definitely, it's not. Yeah, AI is right now really the number one thing, or at least I think so. And what I think is that there should be a little bit more security awareness, but that's just like a tiny statement for what I'm right now thinking about in Microsoft in-house, so that every consultant or TSP that goes to the customer, it's going over there with security in mind, and that's more like their value. So I'm not saying it's not, but it should be more vocalized. Yeah. So for example, when there's a person that goes and says, okay, there is this kind of solution, that, but why do we really need it? Because we know how that would affect the general business risk that's related with cybersecurity. And I would love to hear that, for example, as a customer, so that awareness is pushed through these kind of people, because they are mentoring also through their solutions and through their technology, how the market is actually moving forward. So I think that will be nice, like a cherry to add.
That's a very nice cherry to add on the top there. And I think actually reading some of the Microsoft blogs, their Secure Futures initiatives, tying executive pay to security outcomes, never going to be a bad thing, I don't think. And actually they've got kind of their 6 pillars that they're working on there. And the top one, the number one, is identity and secrets. So, the things we've been talking about, the importance of today. Before we run out of time, we've got the classic 2024 webinar question that I'm going to throw at Terry. AI threats, fact or fiction, is the question.
I think it's a big fact. We're starting to see some crazy scams coming at us. I'm sure you heard what happened it was in Asia, where the person wired $25 million to the wrong bank account. And you're thinking, how silly. Like, why wouldn't you just call the management up and verify it? Well, he actually jumped onto a Zoom call with his so-called colleagues, but they're all deep fakes. So that is crazy what's coming, because now the AI is going to be able to create really amazing phishing emails that has been thoroughly researched and make it very credible. You're going to click on stuff you're not supposed to, get your company infected. And now it's going to force you to get your own AI to combat their AI. It's like become like a steroided AI bots fighting each other.
I worry about this, because I'm sure Paula will know that when you are running a business, regardless of what industry you are in, nowadays you kind of have to be online. You have to be on social media, right? So like your face is out there, your voice is out there, your mannerisms are out there. So where does that lead? So in terms of deep fakes, you're giving out a lot of information just by existing on the internet. That definitely concerns me, Terry. I think that's a really good point to raise. And if a member of my team, say if I got compromised and my company got compromised and, our communication tool did, someone could just ring them looking like me and say, I just wanted to ring you and make sure that you're going to pay that invoice because I'm stuck in Azerbaijan and I can't pay it. It would look really real. It was terrifying.
It is, yeah. We actually did an experiment internally with one of our teams. We've got our security evangelist Murray Haber, and we took all the clips of him online and created a fake version of him, and the audio was perfect. It had all his speech and mannerisms in. I think we're just trying to work out how to productionize it now so we can send him to more events virtually as a an AI representative. In fact, probably all of you, Paula might save you those 200 plus flights every year if we could get a deep fake of you that we could just appear at events as a hologram maybe. So interesting thought to end our time together here on there. But wrapping up from that session, so Microsoft Vulnerabilities Report is out. Everyone who has attended this will be able to get a download of that. If not, head over to beyondtrust.com. You'll be able to download the report, read the expert commentary, read the findings there. But I think, you've learned from our expert panel here today, it really does come down to forgetting about the hype and all the things going on, the acronyms that are out there in the industry, and really focusing on getting the basics right, configuring things securely, thinking about how an attacker might get into your environment, how they might abuse an identity, and what controls you can put in place to mitigate that, and realize that security is not a destination, it's an ongoing journey. We're constantly maturing, we're constantly refining as our Microsoft, and we're on this journey together to keep things secure. If you have enjoyed the session today, if you want to hear more from any of these fine guests we've had on, they have all been guests on the Adventures of Alice and Bob podcast. So I highly encourage you to listen to their episodes, and you can find out which one of them nearly knocked themselves out doing a roly-poly in a server room. With that, we thank you for your time here today. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next session.